Democratic Alliance, saying it's confident that its diverse candidate list will rescue the country from the ANC. 14 out of 30 candidates are women, with Federal Council Chairperson Helen Zille saying all those chosen were done based on merit. Let's speak now about the prospects of this party on May the 29th, and we speak to former DA leader Tony Leon. Mr. Leon, good evening to you, and thank you for your time. Last month, you wrote that voters will get 3 versions of the ANC on May the 29th. I'd like for you to just keep that in mind, but we're going to park it for a second and deal with where you place the Democratic Alliance and its prospects come May the 29th.
Well, I think one doesn't need to be an election psephologist to suggest that the DA on any set of circumstances, and certainly on all polls, will come in second. Mm-hmm. And we can discuss that 3 versions of the ANC on the ballot, because I think that'll influence what happens after the 29th of May. But the question, whether the DA does, by their standards, relatively well, which would be in the upper 20s, 27%, I see suggested by some, or remains in the doldrums on the lower reaches of the 20s, 20, 21%. Well, that will be an electoral outcome, and there'll be some speculation. But because I strongly believe that we've got the most uncertain election in our democratic history since 1994, a lot of what happens to the DA after the election will be determined by how well or how badly the ANC does. That's obviously a concern to the country too. Mm. So, in other words, the DA is conducting an election campaign as it does. It's nominated candidates as it did yesterday. But it's basically going about largely trying to mobilize its supporters, historic, estranged, and possibly a pool of future supporters. Whereas the other campaign is all on the ANC terrain, where the DA largely, or to some great extent, doesn't fish. And that's where the competition is very intense between what I called in my column, as you mentioned, the 3 versions of the ANC, the classic ANC led by Ramaphosa, the EFF breakaway ANC, and now the MK breakaway ANC. And in a way, if that competition intensifies as it appears to be doing, and if the batch of polls we saw, and even the recent by-elections in KZN and Mpumalanga are correct, well, the ANC is going to be driven down to an historic low, and then it's going to have to cast about with whom it forms the next government. Does it reconstitute the ANC in government with the EFF and the MK, with all the hazards that entails? Does it reach out to the DA afterwards? And then that's got risks, big risks for both parties, maybe less risk for the country as a whole. Mm. So I think what the DA is trying to do in this election is to consolidate support, maybe grow it some, and then it's not going to control what happens on the other side of the political fence in this bun fight among those various versions of the ANC. But some of those results that we're seeing, as I said, in by-elections and polls, are extraordinary. I mean, particularly the latest ENCA marked data poll, it had the ANC down to 13% in KwaZulu-Natal. Now, I'm not saying it's going to happen on election day, but it's an indicator that we have more fluidity, more fractiousness, more uncertainty, actually, in this election than we've ever had before. And I guess the DA's advantage is that it has consolidated itself as an opposition brand across the country, as a governing brand in the Western Cape. So it has a certain advantage over a lot of other parties who are also competing for that vote, because they perhaps are less known, they're less well established, and they have leaders who perhaps still have to introduce themselves to the voters.
Well, let's discuss your version that the DA will come in second. And I want to challenge that, because 2019, they lost their official opposition status in KwaZulu-Natal, the province you've just mentioned. Yeah. In the Western Cape, the polls, some of the polls, suggesting that in the Western Cape, where they currently govern, they could potentially lose the majority status, if you like. And I wonder whether you will place any premium on the prospects that Naledi Pandor could be fielded by the ANC as its Western Cape Premier candidate?
Okay, let me just answer those two very quickly. The first is, I don't think it really matters, to be brutally honest, which party is the official opposition in the provincial legislature. No disrespect to provincial MPs, but they don't really get a huge amount of space in the media or even in the voters' conscience. I think what happens in the National Assembly and Parliament is more significant. Obviously, Parliament's got far more powers than the provinces do. So I'd be absolutely surprised if the DA doesn't still emerge as the national official opposition. I take your point that this might not pertain to the provinces. On the Western Cape, the one thing that struck me was when I looked at the registration weekends that we had, is the extreme outperformance by the DA in its safe wards of registering new voters. This is in Cape Town, compared to the ANC in its stronghold wards in Cape Town. In other words, the DA was, I think the one figure I saw, 10-1 advantage. So even if the polls, and obviously they're snapshots and I don't disrespect them, if the polls suggest that, well, the DA might dip below 50, I think that registration advantage here in the Western Cape is going to have a significant effect on the outcome. As regards Naledi Pandor, well, I have to say this, it'll be quite difficult for her to become Premier because she's not on the provincial list. She's only on the National Assembly list, the ANC, rather low down. I think it's 87th out of 200. Yeah. But she's not on the provincial list. Now, of course, they can change those lists. I think they have 24 hours or something to do that. But, you know, I would be really surprised if she would, you know, hugely influence the outcome of a provincial election. I mean, she's Minister of International Relations, so it'll be a bit odd for her standing in a provincial contest. The second thing is, if she's got any traction and support because of, for example, her stance on Gaza and Hamas, well, the ANC is going to reflect that, if it is an advantage, and I think one can argue that, whether or not she's the Premier candidate or not. So I suspect this is not realistic. I think it's just kind of attention seeking, not by her, but by the people who are promoting it. And I don't think the identity of the Premier candidate is going to change the dynamics that I've referred to. But let's see. Look, the one thing about an election is nothing is certain, and this election is less certain than any other since 1994.
A final question on the aspect of the DA, because I want to move to the ANC topic. In your view, has the Democratic Alliance alienated sections of its support base around South Africa? And perhaps you might want to focus the attention once again in the Western Cape, based on its refusal to condemn Israel's war on Gaza, because that has certainly gotten a lot of people unhappy about the DA's stance.
Yeah, look, I think the DA, I happen to agree with the DA's stance. I think Israel has every right to defend itself from the horrifying attacks of 7th of October. But, you know, I'm not directing the DA's political strategy. Will this affect the outcome? I think it will in some areas. I'm told reliably, I don't know if this is correct, I haven't seen the figures myself, that even among people who self-identify as Muslims in the Cape Town, only 10% say that the stance on Gaza, whether it's the ANC or the DA, will affect their vote. Now, you can say, well, 10% of a big community is something. I think it is. But it suggests that for most voters of all persuasions and religions, there are other factors, class factors, race factors, economic factors, which determines their votes. And it might have some depressing effect on the DA turnout, but I think it might be on the margins. I mean, for example, there are, I think, 7 times as many evangelical Christians in South Africa as there are Muslims, and evangelicals have taken a very strong pro-Israel stance. Now, I'm not for a moment suggesting that all evangelicals will, because of that, vote for the DA. I don't think that for a moment. I think for all the reasons that there's going to be other factors that influence votes, whether you're Christian or Muslim, I think it's going to pertain across the board. But, you know, once again, it's in the range what Mr. Rumsfeld called the known unknowns. We know it might have some effect, we just don't know what effect or what percentage.
Let's then move to the 3 versions of the ANC come May 29th. You've already listed them. It's Ramaphosa-led ANC, Julius Malema, EFF, and belatedly former President Jacob Zuma and the MK party, although he does stress that he's just a campaigner. Nonetheless,
yes.
Nonetheless, in your article, you seem to play on this idea that when will the ANC split? A person listening, in fact, someone may come from that party and say, no, you're wrong, Tony Leon, because that's not an ANC split, as you mentioned, these three versions. If anything, these are splinters from the ANC. How would you respond?
Well, it depends how you define a splinter, in the sense, I mean, obviously the ANC still retains a hefty loyalty, premium loyalty among its traditional supporters. Even if the ANC does as badly as 40%, that means that 40% of South Africans still support the ANC, and only a much lesser percentage will support the Malema, EFF, or the Zuma MK. But, you know, when I talked about a split, I mean, we now have seen two historic splits from the ANC of significance. COPE was another split which petered out pretty quickly. But, you know, the EFF is a durable split. It came out of the ANC Youth League. It's established itself. It's got political real estate. It's got very strong leadership. You don't have to agree with the leader, but he's strong. And they've got about 10% of the vote, even on a relatively bad day for them. Jacob Zuma, and, you know, we all have views about Jacob Zuma, is, I think, probably the best-known politician in the entire country, maybe even including Cyril Ramaphosa. I mean, he was the president, you know, for, 9 years? And he is an outsized personality for reasons good and bad. And just the number of people, I was listening to a pollster who did one of the latest polls saying that they went door to door. In other words, their polling was done face-to-face, well, not over the phone. And they didn't give people a list of parties to say, you know, will you support the ANC or the DA? They said, which you're going to support. And spontaneously, 13% of the respondents said Zuma or the MK. Now, that's an extraordinary accomplishment if you say the party's just about 6 or 2 months old. But, of course, it's not 2 months old. Jacob Zuma's been in the public consciousness for 30 years. And when he transferred his allegiance and his name and his brand to the MK, that made the difference. I mean, if Jacob Zuma was not in the MK, they'd be featuring in the less than 1% category of the polls. The fact that they are featuring so significantly, even if it is less than the ANC, and can determine the provincial outcomes in maybe 3 provinces, and certainly the national outcome, I think speaks to its own story that he has split from the ANC. I believe the ANC is in the process of disciplining him. Well, that seems to be, you know, the horses already bolted from the stable.
All right, Tony Leon, we could have stretched this interview. However, I'm out of time because there is a suggestion from you that could the MKB turn out to be a real power broker. But I'll have to invite you another time for that conversation.
Thank you.
Tony Leon.
I enjoyed the conversation. Thank you so much for the opportunity.
Thank you very much, Tony Leon, former DA leader.